Okay, welcome, friends and comrades. Thank you for being here either in person or virtually to remember Patrick Quinn, Joanna Misnik, and Abra Quinn. Some of us here were connected to all three of these comrades, others to just one of them. And in the case of Joanna and Patrick, whose activity on the left stretches back to the first half of the 1960s, there's long and intertwined histories present in this room and by those joining virtually from many countries and 3 continents. And we'll hear some of those histories in a bit. When some of us brought in the additional chairs to this space yesterday, there was actually a baby shower going on for a member of 33rd Working Families. And I thought that was really beautiful symbolism in a couple of ways. Obviously for the direct connection to the cycle of life and death, but also as an indication of the vitality of this space and organization. It's the Office of the 33rd Ward Working Families, which is an independent political organization. And although neither Joanna, Abra, or Patrick were involved with it, it nevertheless reflects many of the ideals that were most important to all three, such as non-sectarian political, independent political action, incorporation of feminist and gender liberation movements, internationalism, and so much more. And so I think it's a fitting location for us to add this memorial. The origin of this gathering is bittersweet, also not just for the obvious reasons that it's a commemoration of people we've lost, but also that the idea originally came from Abra at the memorial service for her father Patrick in Wisconsin this past January. She had hoped to have a second gathering in Chicago over the summer, perhaps, which could more fully recognize the political dimensions of his life. We discussed some of the basic logistics to make this happen at that gathering. Of course, it's not how things played out. Joanna and then Abra also died this year in September and October, respectively. All three of these comrades identified with the same political tradition of the Fourth International and spent most of their adult lives in the same socialist organization, Solidarity. All three had deep mutual respect for one another. Beyond that, I think all of them, each of them in their own ways, really valued the concept of, this is an in-joke, revolutionary continuity, not in terms of dogmatic adherence to a particular Trotskyist tradition, but rather in the history and accumulated legacies of real human beings who make up the broader working class struggle for universal liberation. So today we'll celebrate the legacy of these three and commit to continuing that work and struggle for a better world. And also it's can be a little bit noisy in this room, so try to limit your side conversations. Although ad hoc comment, I think that also that might not be the best appreciation of Joanna's legacy. But finally, the speakers list in the program is actually kind of arbitrary. So if you don't want to go in that order, let me know and we can self-organize and just make it happen. But thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Robin. I know a lot of you. I met Joanna in 2017 when we both joined DSA and started going to the same chapter meetings here in Chicago. I soon admired her. She had a strong voice, confident and resonant. She made her points without hesitation in the manner of someone with a lot of experience to back them up. I sought out her mentorship and eventually asked her to coffee. She, for her part, was already cheering me on. I remember telling her that I was going to work on Jeanette Taylor's campaign in late 2018, and her instant delight and recognition that it was an important step. Joanna's perspective, the long vision with years at its back, and the many-year arc toward a socialist future ahead of it was what I needed as a young person in the movement. I still need it. Joanna was there for many early milestones in DSA. She was at the 2017 National Convention. She attended the first meetings of the CDSA Electoral Working Group. She was at the chapter convention where we took on our first chapter campaign fighting for rent control, and the one where we endorsed Carlos Versana and Byron in the 2019 election. She was part of the Solidarity for Bernie campaign, a CDSA-led campaign that brought together 24 Chicago progressive groups to support Bernie in 2020. She was thrilled to be part of it. She was quick to see the significance of an organization of this size sprouting up, of thousands of socialists getting together, many of them new to socialism but eager for political change. I could say she was a stalwart DSA comrade who made great contributions to the organization. This is true. But Joanna's contributions didn't begin and end with any one organization. Spend 6 decades an active socialist in the US and Europe, and you'll see more than one organization grow and break apart. That's part of what made Joanna an invaluable mentor. She could celebrate the rise of the new socialist movement in the form of DSA's resurgence without becoming a booster. She never let it slide when she heard young DSAers use the phrase building power to describe what they were accomplishing by, for example, electing socialists to office. Rightly, I think, she heard this as a dangerous self-inflation. She wanted us to keep things in perspective, to be realistic about our position. I'm sure she had heard socialists grandstand and lose sight of reality many times before, and recognized it, in fact, as one of the great temptations of leftists. Since Joanna passed away and the written remembrances poured in from comrades all over the world, I've had time to reflect on how short a portion of her life I knew her for. It wasn't the time of best health for her. Her eyesight was getting worse, and her immunocompromised state from being on chemo for leukemia meant she was confined to her home after COVID hit. Yet Joanna and I formed a close bond. It was important to me to be able to visit her and share her company in the middle months of the pandemic. Though a great socialist innovator and leader, she was also an old lady living alone with no relatives in easy distance, and she needed help with things. When I visited, I helped out with what I could, whether it was deciphering mail and paying bills, doing taxes, putting together a new vacuum cleaner, or setting up glue traps to catch mice. These tasks weren't anybody's idea of fun, but it was meaningful to me to be able to share Joanna's company and do these simple things for her. I valued our friendship a great deal. I love Joanna and I will miss her.
I struggled a lot with what to say today because I think first and foremost, this year has been, one of grief. More than the personal grief of losing my grandfather in January and then my aunt in October. It has also been a terrifying political year. And in some way it feels even crueler that the last things that Abra Quinn saw as she left this world were the most cynical things you could say about American democracy, that it would crumble and that fascism would rise. But I think that both Abra Quinn and Patrick Quinn left a political legacy for me and my sister that is invaluable and that has been unique, incredibly unique. I remember in 4th grade realizing when I think Obama was being elected for one of the times that not everyone knew what communism was. And I don't think that I knew what it was either, but I remember going to class and realizing that not everyone had a communist grandpa. I was raised with radical language. Before I knew who Trotsky or Marx or Lenin was, I knew what solidarity was. I could tell you stories of my grandpa and my aunt's activism, but it's most important that they inspire me and the people around me. And that through carrying on their political legacy, they're passing in this very cruel world, in this hellscape of a healthcare institution that we were so unfortunately intimate with this summer, that I can continue that legacy through my own activism. I feel honored to carry their legacy and the legacy of American working class politics. I feel almost like I'm from this weird dynasty of political action. I can't describe what it means to know revolution like a bedtime story. Anti-capitalism every time there was an ad break during the Packers. Anti-imperialism being laced through every old family photo. And solidarity like a guiding light in the chaos of this world. I was raised to know that life is revolution and revolution is life. These lessons have been carefully passed down to me from my aunt and from my grandpa. Well, maybe not as carefully from Patrick, but passed down nonetheless. But the most important lesson I learned from Abra and Patrick was one that they never told me explicitly, but is the one that I hold most dear and the lesson that shapes my politics most deeply. That is the value of conversation. And this may be a little far out, for Patrick was sometimes not a converser, and sometimes it was more like arguing. But they showed me at these big family dinners and holidays sitting around in our living room by the Christmas tree that politics are a negotiation. And though none of them, Abra or Patrick, would admit that they were wrong, Abra would. Patrick was another case. The act of engaging in this conversation about politics, of negotiating what means and what situation, and the history and the legacy that we all carry and the context that we are living in, showed me the most important thing about politics is not that there is some checklist. There is no one right ideology. But there is a process of negotiation between what it means to know justice and revolution that I don't think I would have had if not for both of them. I carry their legacy with me every day. More than their political legacy, their legacy of life and of traveling and exploring and this constant desire and hunger for knowledge. I feel that in my blood, and I am forever grateful for it. Thank you for letting me speak here today.
I met Abra when I started attending meetings for Solidarity in Oakland in 1998 or 1999. When we became friends, she'd like to remember that we had emailed each other when I was first interested in Solidarity a couple of years before that. From the start, we were friendly comrades, usually agreeing and being interested in chasing an idea into its historical or global connections, occasionally disagreeing on organizational issues. During the 2001 to 2004 anti-war movement, we became closer personal friends, and that's also a time that I remember as kind of a high watermark for those of us around Solidarity in Oakland, trying to connect our politics to what was going on locally and to revitalize our own organization. Abra engaged in that with a great deal of curiosity and an attitude of conscious experimentation. I particularly remember the way she got involved with direct action to stop the war. It was something of a personal and political double-take for her. She was a socialist from a very young age, identifying with the Fourth Internationalist tradition of Joanna, Patrick, and others. After being sidelined or purged from the SWP multiple times, that tradition had rethought a lot of things, particularly abandoning the idea of the Leninist microsect in advance of the founding of Solidarity. Abra was always proud to have been one of a very small number of Solidarity's youth at its founding in 1986. However, both among the SWP majority and the opposition, there had been little or no rethinking of another principle: the idea that stopping a war or other massive social change would only really happen as a result of mass action, huge protests, leading to something more disruptive on a scale of millions, not the civil disobedience that was very popular in the late 1960s and early 70s. As a new anti-war movement was taking shape after 9/11, Solidarity went through a process of debate over this. For those of us who hadn't been around in the 1960s and 70s, there was a lot of confusion. Abra was one of the people who could translate. Having been politically attuned from a very young age, she could totally understand why some in the 60s generation were hesitant about rethinking this, while she could also totally understand what was compelling about the call to direct action in the 2000s. Pretty quickly, Solidarity decided to solidarize with the anti-war movement without claiming any contradiction between mass action and direct action. Abra threw herself into this, getting involved in the Bay Area Direct Action to Stop the War coalition that was an outgrowth of the global justice movement. She navigated this with a great deal of seriousness and humor. She never lost track of her own political traditional axis, but she was always open to rethinking things, too. At the same time, she would never move too quickly, intellectually, when the group seized on a popular way of thinking that jarred with hers. At the same time, she was soon telling me about a talk by Starhawk that she recently attended, and how I really ought to attend one soon myself. When I think about Abra, and when I think about how the people who loved her talk about her, the words loyalty and tradition often come up. She was in many ways the most loyal of loyal friends, and she loved her own personal family traditions, observing them, talking about them, and thinking about them. She also identified with and was loyal to a political tradition that her family was identified with, though as the DASW example shows, she was willing to rethink some of the conclusions of that tradition for the sake of a live engagement with real current social movements. When I think of Joanna, those ideas about conveying a tradition often come up as well. Joanna often talked about conveying the lessons learned from political participation in a healthy, debating socialist organization. These were lessons that, if they were learned by young socialists who were activists in social movements with real social weight, could help to transfer the best of a political tradition from her generation and older generations to a new one. Abra always identified as coming from the same political tradition as Joanna. If anyone defined her tradition, it was Joanna and Patrick, and then other family members and the FI. Abra's way of thinking about political tradition was consciously in sync with Joanna, but when I think about how both of them talked about it, Abra's way of engaging with it was both narrower and broader. It was narrower in that she would often recount those travails of her family members' experiences in the SWP, expulsions, rejoining, double recruiting. And even though that tendency had long since dissolved as a specific entity, Abra still continued to feel a loyalty to the politics of that tradition. We would often talk about a shared assessment of international politics and a commitment to the politics of mass movement building that we could talk about in those terms. And even though that notion of tradition feels mostly narrower than what Joanna liked to talk about, at least in large groups that included me, there was also an aspect that was broader. Not being as focused on organization, Abra was extremely interested in what she, and by implication other people who shared her political tradition and way of thinking, could learn from others. I think Joanna was interested in that too, but her way of doing it always came with more of an agenda, whereas Abra enjoyed more of an open-ended curiosity. In later years, after I moved out of the country, I often felt that Abra was the person most concretely tethering me to a political tradition that I had come to embrace. To lose Patrick, Joanna, and Abra all in 1 year feels politically catastrophic. I suppose in the sense that a deep space explorer who still has access to oxygen tanks might lose a connection to a ship going the other way, and be sure that they will never connect with that whole wing of humanity again. There is a future, but it is untethered. It was worth all of the effort to build the connections, Joanna would always remind us. We didn't really do it as well as we needed to, and there are consequences. And yet, Abra, and I think Joanna too, were always attentive to what was happening in the moment. They could both have their very pessimistic moments or weeks, but neither of them was ever swallowed whole by those. Today, I'd love to hear both of their takes on Mayor Mamdani and the other developments of the past few weeks. And I think, in spite of this catastrophic untethering, they would both be open to and excited for the political developments of the coming years.
Hello, my name is Liam McQuaid. I had hoped to take part in this online celebration of the lives of Abra, Patrick and Joanna as it was happening, but I'm travelling back from Galway. However, I really did want to make some sort of small contribution to commemorating the lives of these three remarkable people. Patrick I first met in London in 1986. It was at a conference of the International Socialist Group, as it was then called. He found me and we started talking about Irish politics, British politics, American politics, and ended up going for a few beers, and that became a bit of a tradition. Every time Patrick and Mary would come to London, we'd meet up, often have a curry and always a few pints, generally speaking, in the approach. And they very generously hosted me and my previous partner Penny when we visited the United States on my first and what looks likely to be the last for quite some time trip to that country. So we stayed in touch, and for me Patrick represented the best of the broad political tradition to which many of us belong. He was inquisitive, had strong opinions, was well informed, was an activist, but was always willing to listen and learn from other people, even if he disagreed with them. And right to the end, his last trip, he was very inquisitive about the Corbyn movement, and you could see that he was somebody who was keeping an eye on the politics in the wider world, not just the United States. Abra, around that time, she came to study in Brighton in the University of Sussex. Patrick had told me that his daughter would be arriving, so we met up and began a very close relationship for the period that she was in the country. When she went back to the United States, we remained in touch, something that became infinitely easier with the development of this technology, which is allowing us to participate here today. Her loss, her death hit me hard, very hard. Even after all this time, she was somebody of whom I remained very, very fond. And it's so unjust that somebody who should have had so many years ahead of her has been taken from us. It has been a privilege to get to know the Quinn family through Abra and Patrick, and I hope that this is a relationship that can continue. Maddie and I were very pleased to meet Rachel and Tim when they came to London last year. Joanna, I only knew by reputation, but from what I've read of her and what I've heard about her, she was, again, a very formidable, very impressive woman whose death is a great loss to the American working class and the working class internationally. Things are sometimes looking a little bit better at the minute, and the election result in New York, the rise of the Greens here in Britain, has given us all some cause for optimism. So it's good that we're all part of that legacy that Joanna, Patrick and Abra created. My sympathy to the friends and the family, and I miss them all dearly.
No, I don't know. Where are you, Penny?
Well, I'm at home in Paris, France. I would obviously say that I'm pleased to see old friends and comrades, except unfortunately, particularly when you're of my generation, more and more we only meet old friends and comrades on these sad occasions. I myself live very close to the Père Lachaise cemetery in Paris, where a lot of revolutionaries wish to have their final act, and so I do seem to attend many such occasions, and they're always obviously the reminder of what we have lived through together and tried to build together, and how far we've succeeded is always a moment that is both brings good memories and also, particularly when we look at the state of the world today, reminds us that we haven't done so well. And for those of us of my generation that were active from the beginning of the 70s and others before in the 60s, obviously, we started out with much higher hopes than I think the younger generations who, and all courage to them, who are coming into activity today will have, because we actually thought that things could really still change. I mean, as a young revolutionary in Europe, there was a revolution on our continent in 1974. There was, at the end of that decade, the Nicaraguan revolution in the Americas. Obviously, Portugal has not, it's not the same, fortunately, trajectory that Nicaragua, but so many comrades who went on brigades and so on to Nicaragua, and to see now the situation, and then not to mention, obviously, Ukraine, Palestine, Sudan, the Congo, the wars, the repression, the climate chaos, the mass refugee movements. It's obviously a very difficult situation, and that does indeed make us miss comrades like Abra, Joanna and Patrick. I knew Abra in particular for a while in the 1980s when she was in Europe, and I was a full-timer at the centre, and she came to help us out on International Viewpoint. I met Patrick on a number of occasions when he visited Europe, and he was an old friend of a friend of mine, John Barsman. So we would meet up. But obviously the person that I knew best was Joanna, because I first met her, in fact, in the 1970s when she was first in Europe. But it was really from the beginning of the 1990s when she was, like I was, elected to the international leadership, that I would see her regularly in international meetings. We had some points in common that, in a sense, brought us together. She had been a full-timer in the centre. I had been a full-timer in the International Centre, so we had experiences to share, and we knew the people. We knew Ernest and Livio and so on a day-to-day basis, as it were. And we had a lot of political agreement. I won't say that we were always in agreement on everything, but Joanna was that thing that is unfortunately still too rare, which is a woman political leader, not as a lot of women comrades in the leadership were, particularly associated with one or the other area of work, obviously in particular feminist work, but as a central political leader of an organization in an important country. and where she obviously played a central role in leading the comrades who remained convinced of our political orientation through the difficult times of the expulsion from the SWP, what happened after that, navigating through all that process to the foundation of Solidarity, and then leading Solidarity for the last 40 years, more or less, from the mid 1980s. I don't know whether all comrades have been able to read or heard the greetings, the tribute on behalf of the Bureau that I made for the comrades of Solidarity, and is published on the International Viewpoint site, which obviously underlines all of that about Joanna's invaluable contribution and the importance for us of, in particular, having somebody who could bring a sharp analysis of what was going on in the United States, because, as I say, obviously the role of the United States on the world scene makes it extremely important that we should follow and understand what is happening there, and in particular, obviously, the political dynamics of the left. So we remember what Joanna wrote about the Jesse Jackson campaign, also the importance, correctly, that later, obviously, she gave to the development of DSA, and so on. And I think, but I think that most of you know that, obviously, from a different point of view, but as well as I do. But the several photos that I've been able to send show, in particular, Joanna in a more social setting in those international meetings. And that, again, we have to underline Joanna's willingness and ability to sit and discuss and talk, and in a friendly and warm manner with all comrades, whatever the political disagreements with them. So we shared, indeed, many bottles of wine together in those circumstances. But as was underlined in the message that we sent, she certainly enjoyed a lot of respect for her political and leadership abilities, which, just to read a part of that, because this was a tribute that was sent by a comrade from Mexico who is actually no longer a member of the Fourth International, but obviously had a very clear memory. We almost always chose her to chair the meetings of the leadership bodies of the Fourth International. When passions ran high and shouting began, she would calmly say, "I am used to dealing with poor young people in New York, so either calm down or you will find out that with my experience, none of you impressed me. So be quiet and let the meeting continue." We all obeyed Joanna, not only because we did not want her to treat us like young delinquents from the Bronx, but because we loved and respected her very much. And I think that that was a sentiment that was very much shared by comrades. I would just also like to say, on a more personal note, that Joanna, who had not always had an easy life, coming to Europe, going back, one of the questions of, as Robin pointed out, she was a woman who lived on her own, and so on. And so I was happy to be able to take her to London, so where she stayed with me, with my mother. But then we went to visit Bath, because she was very keen on Jane Austen, the novels, the films, and so on. So we were able to visit Bath to see where so many of those are set. And on another occasion, when we invited her to the NPA Summer University, I was able to drive her down to the south of France, and passing through the Loire Valley so that we could visit castles, Chateau de la Loire, which was something else that she had very much wanted to do. So as I said, I was very pleased to be able to enable her to do that. And on the one occasion when I was able to come to Chicago, we went on the boat trip of the Architectural Society, which was great as well. So I have many memories, very fond memories of Joanna, but in particular, I miss her very much as a point of reference politically, because, as I say, she stood out as a political leader in our international, and to have a woman as such a political leader is, I think, a very important reference point for an identification for other women in the international. Thank you.
So I could pretend that I'm all flustered because he changed the order of the program and I had this long, carefully prepared speech, but it's not so. I never have a long, carefully prepared speech, but I did know each of these three people very well over the years. I remember Abra from when I first moved to Madison at 17, and she was a 3-year-old, and I would babysit her sometimes when Marty and Patrick would go out. I would hang around with her when she was bored at our headquarters in the basement at 202 West Gilman Street. I would play with her, and then later on, over the years, after she had moved to Chicago, I would take her out and we would have sort of Atlee adventures periodically. And John and I babysat a few weekends while Patrick and Marty went away and tested out the waters of parenthood in that way with the two little girls who obviously grew up to be amazing women, both of them. So I remember Abra that way. I remember Abra when she came back from Britain, and I remember Abra as she went off to graduate school and studied and learned so much intellectually. And she was an amazing person in her smarts, because her smarts were not just academic smarts. They had incorporated so much of what she had learned from her parents politically, and so much of what she had learned in terms of how to relate to people and things like that. So I just wanted to share the young Abra memories that I had with you all, because they were very special to me. And I remember her, telling me about her first kiss and all of these kinds of things that, were very important to me as a young pre-mother mothering somebody else's kid on an occasional weekend or trip out to do something. So I met Patrick when I was 17. He was 27. He and Marty were married and had this little girl and were the main source of everything in the Madison YSA. There were other people of their generation too, and me and this guy, Jeff Meisner, were the babies of the YSA in Madison. Jeff was even a year younger than I was. And it was kind of amazing to have these people who were grown-ups but still young and active and relatable to, who taught me so much, who spent hours. We had educationals every week where we had readings that we had to do for our educationals every week. It was intense. And we spent our whole lives at the headquarters, making flyers, putting stencils together, running the mimeograph machine, doing all of those things. And I just can't say how much I learned from Patrick in those early years. My whole understanding of and I don't go around saying I'm a Trotskyist, because it doesn't mean much to me to say that at this point, although it's a whole orientation and way of life. But I don't want a sectarian label. The whole orientation and way of life, I'd say I owe largely to Patrick, of giving me that framework of understanding the world, understanding class forces, understanding how to build mass movements, things like that. And I remember, especially with the anti-war movement, he and I were representatives to a group called MAPAC, the Madison Area Peace Action Coalition. He was a representative, I forget from what group, and I was representing the Student Mobilization Committee, which they had put me in at 17 as the co-chair of. And of course, I had no idea that I was being recruited and that I was being trained and that they put me in there for all of those reasons, but it eventually became clear. But I learned so much going to coalition meetings with old communists in Madison, with the MSPAC family and things like that. I learned so much about how you build compromise, where you decide that you're drawing your line, how you draw your line, how you still maintain relationships with people who you have bitter disagreements with. And those were very big things. And I think that they're lessons that I've tried over the years to share with as many people as I can. Now, let me talk about Joanna. So, Joanna was for many years one of my best friends. And I will say for all here, we had a falling out at some point. We eventually came back together. It wasn't ever quite the same, but Joanna was the biggest woman I know. Not in size and stature, of course, but she was the first real woman political leader I knew. The first person who read and analyzed and delved and argued with the big boys. And boy, could she do that well. Boy, could she do that well. She kicked ass when she did that. And Joanna was smart, so smart, and so able to synthesize information and draw political conclusions from information. She was also often angry. She was angry about how unfairly her life had gone. She was angry on behalf of the working class on how unfairly all of their lives were going and how unfairly society treated people. She was angry, and sometimes her anger was hard for people to deal with. Sometimes her anger propelled us forward in very positive ways. So I want to also remember Joanna in a more personal way as the Auntie Jo to my kids, or when they were littler, Auntie Jojo. And all the times that she came to Chicago from Detroit and from Memphis for endless weekend NC meetings and things like that, or conferences, and stayed with us and played with the kids and helped Emily write stories before Emily knew how to write, and always was there for Thanksgiving and usually for Christmas too, unless she went to Cleveland. And she was just a very big part of our family constellation for many years. And in the later years, it was good to spend time with her and to have her feel that she could say whatever the hell she wanted to say. And some of what she said was outrageous, of course. We all know that. And some of it was perhaps judgmental and unfair about people, possibly. I see a little laughter in that corner where Alex is standing. But Joanna was also so warm and so full of love and so sentimental, so emotional and sentimental. And it's hard for people who see her as this hard-ass politico to remember that she was also super tender and sentimental. I just, there were a lot of things that meant so much to her, whether it was the young comrades who came to visit her, whether it was a call from someone, whether it was a drinking session with Christine in the office, or after hours, of course, or whatever it was. All these things meant a lot to her, and the connections that she had with people. It was very hard for her with the pandemic and with the blindness and with the not being able to drive and not being able to pore endlessly over documents and articles and books. It was hard for her to find her, I'll do this horrible pun, mojo in that period. But Joanna is just, she was my inspiration, and she was in so many ways a mentor, a friend, a political dynamo, and someone who had impact, sure, on the 45 people who are here, but also on hundreds of other people in her role in coalition meetings, in speaking at different events, and just showing people how you can be a revolutionary fighter for life. Thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Patrick. Thank you, Abra.
I've known Joanna for more than 15 years during a period of her life where she used to like to characterize herself as a typist. And for any of you who have seen the interview that was done with Jacobin, that I highly recommend. It was what, September 1st, 2018? Or no, yeah, I'm not quite sure of the year, but it's still on her website. And it is quite good because you definitely get a feeling of what Joanna was like as a person, but you don't get the full flavor of like what Debbie also knew her as. She was a dynamo. She was a redhead and she was a red. And for those of you who had any involvement in all of the political movements that have gone on, you know, her finest moments were what she recalls about the Fourth International and Solidarity. But she also taught me a lot. Joanna was about, I think, 8 years older than I, but we were very much in the same genre. And actually, when I first met her, when I came to Local 73, which is where she had spent more than a decade, she had actually described herself as a typist. That was no joke, you know, and as she also pointed out, sometimes she was referred to as a typist because she did type 90 words a minute. But what that didn't really show people is how well she could write. I am sorry that she didn't put everything that she knew in writing. Her experiences captured decades, you know, going back to the free speech movement in Berkeley when she was there, and, you know, how the reason she went back to Cleveland was because I forgot what his name was, but he was a famous poet and he was chanting, "Oh." And so she went back to Cleveland where, you know, she had some adventures as well. But the thing that I learned more from Joanna about is that she was truly non-sectarian. Now, that didn't mean she wouldn't disagree with you, but she understood that we can't, you know, one of the best things I liked about one of her interviews is that she had said something along the lines about, look, we've got 1,500 people here, but what's 1,500 people in terms of really building a working class movement that changes society? Some of the stories that she used to tell me that she taught me a lot about, because I didn't know anything about it, was actually what happened in 1968 when she was in France with her partner. And she said that that was the experience of her lifetime, because she actually saw workers en masse actually taking over factories and that they built their organizations. But, you know, she also talked about that was the apex, but then started the decline. Because one of the things that she just like hammered into me over and over, is that if you don't have a working class movement that is rooted in the working class, Joanna came from the working class. What radicalized her was many of her experiences in Cleveland. But when she meant that, she meant you have to live that life. You have to be part of those people. And they have to start to believe in you because you are being part of a change that they have wanted to demand and wanted to achieve. The role that she played in Local 73, she was not an officer, but that was not the role she wanted to play. The role that she wanted to play was to agitate amongst people, to get them to come together, to understand, okay, why are we on strike? Well, here's why we're out on strike. And what do you think about that? And then she would always draw out what people wanted, and what would unite them, because the unity in many of the struggles that she was involved in, including like when she was involved in the Chicago teacher strike and all of those things, she touched thousands and thousands of people's lives. I mean, we heard part of her international experience, but a crowd of 1,500 doesn't even express, the people that Joanna touched and changed. And many of the people that actually came forward in the movement after. And I'm sure that all of her memories, somebody should compile many of the things that all of you have known. I knew her for about 15 years, but she was one of the most influential people in my life. She was truly, truly a democratic socialist who believed that let's not start getting sectarian and start having all these different little caucuses. She pointed that out, that if we don't develop a common language, first let's discuss what unites us. First, let's discuss, what brings us all together and what we can achieve when we do that. Actually, when the left was criticizing Ocasio for a while, she actually made a number of different remarks, and they were all true, because Ocasio still is going to show us more. But the thing is that at that point in time, people start getting nitpicky. Oh, no, that was not the program, and that is what she disliked, when people try to just delineate, okay, if you don't agree with these 10 points, then no, you're out. And Joanna had been expelled from a number of different organizations, and she described like that a couple of times. It made her hesitate. Maybe I should change my life's direction. She had lots of different talents, but instead she stuck with it. She stuck with it and found another group of comrades that she could unite with until she felt like that she contributed everything she could. She made many of us who we are today. And I love Joanna, and I miss her greatly, as I am sure that every single one of you who knew her was, or in any event, Joanna will live on in our hearts, in our minds, and let's make sure that we keep her memory alive. Thank you.
I realize I didn't introduce myself at the beginning. My name is Isaac, was then and still is now. And I don't like doing this, but I think I'll mostly just read out some reflections. I wrote trying and not succeeding, I don't think, in capturing what these three people meant to me in my life. When I spoke with Rob Bartlett this summer about the memorial, the idea for this memorial, we were discussing it, and he shared like a crystal clear memory of the first time that he met Joanna in the late 1970s. And it occurred to me that Joanna is somebody who leaves a really strong first impression. I also have a crystal clear image of our first encounter in summer of 2003, actually, with Joanna and Debbie strolling up. I was 20 years old. Joanna was in her early 60s, wearing her signature fire engine red hair and statement eyeglasses, and immediately just totally ripped to shreds someone who I then considered a political mentor. And so I was drawn to her flamboyance and brashness, her expansive vocabulary and creative, hilarious use of the English language that artfully combined exotic and elevated language with crude and really wonderful talent for cursing. Joanna had a harsh exterior that is often the case, armored a quite sensitive and gentle personality, which I was really privileged to become acquainted with over the years. I think an honest assessment from anyone who truly knew Joanna is that she could be a very difficult person to be close to, and really struggled over the course of her life with many wounding experiences. However, honestly, she and I were challenged by many of the same personal insecurities, and that probably facilitated our connection. But anyway, we ended up bonding 25 or so, nearly 25 years ago, immediately, and we stayed up late until the night, every night of that conference, Joanna with her bottle of Jack Daniels, me drinking cheap beer. She imparted her lifetime of accumulated wisdom, and yet was genuinely curious about my own then limited experience and reflections on it. This became a tradition of ours whenever we found ourselves at the same national gatherings, and later when I moved to Chicago. I realized that this was a pattern. Joanna befriended many generations of newcomers to the socialist movement over the decades. It was remarkable at the time, and even more remarkable to me now that I'm older and sometimes struggle to relate to younger activists, much less with 4 decades of age in between us. She had no tolerance for bullshit, especially from men, especially from people from more privileged backgrounds. I remember being able to finally convince her to do an autobiographical interview with Robin, Simon, and myself after years of trying by saying, come on, Joanna, some of these self-important blowhard guys from SDS are already on like their 3rd memoir. And which persuaded her. And that story, like Patrick's, was filled with countless nearly unbelievable encounters with historic individuals and events that just occurred naturally as a side effect of a lifetime of commitment to the struggle. Joanna was an incomparable mentor, never patronizing, never dumbing down what she was saying, and in terms of communicating a Marxist analysis of the world that exemplified the concept that one must first know the rules in order to break them. Joanna was always an iconoclast, but it was informed by deep familiarity with the theory and application of revolutionary politics. Another memory I have is this moment of pride at a Solidarity National Committee meeting, some meeting or other, or just a couple of years into our personal and political relationship, when Joanna was due to speak after me on the stack. And she said that, well, Isaac said most of what I was going to say, and I felt I've really arrived as a Misnikista, which I will be to my dying day, although as sort of annoying tradition that we have on the left, I have to say that we had many disagreements over the years as well, but my worldview fundamentally was shaped by Joanna as by no other individual. At a talk that she delivered following the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, and let me parenthetically say, like, Christine, something that was amazing about Joanna, and one of the insecurities that we shared, is she hated writing, and she was not a writer. And instead, she would basically wing it and get up and deliver the most eloquent, all-encompassing political analysis that you could believe, seemingly off the top of her head. But then when it came to putting that down in the pen, it would not happen. So there was a transcription of a talk from 1991. And this was on the collapse of the Soviet Union and what was the way forward for the socialist movement. And Joanna reflected that sorting through the experiences of the workers' movement in the 20th century to draw lessons should begin from a primary point of agreement that living Marxism or revolutionism is the constant construction of a systemic critique that has to be embodied in organization of living human beings, or it will cease to exist in real social terms. I think that this excerpt was surely about the persistent necessity of socialist organization, but it hints at the parallel truth that these organizations and like history as a whole, are made by the imperfect and complex people who are their architects. It was really from Abra, who I met in summer of 2005, and through many subsequent correspondence and phone calls between us, that I got an appreciation for the importance of these inner private lives and personal biography of revolutionary figures. I later realized that this interest of Abra's was her own much more feminist inflected influence from her father, who had often had the role of eulogizing others himself. I mentioned at the beginning that this event was really Abra's idea, and I felt her absence in trying to envision a personal, envision an appropriate tribute to these three figures. Although we met previously, Patrick and I, the first time I recall speaking at length to him was probably in 2007. I visited he and Mary at their home in Evanston and sat down in front of his wall of books in their house, talked politics for hours. One of the things that stuck out most to me in that conversation was a certain symmetry between his and Joanna's lives, each of them emerging from somewhat provincial working class Midwestern childhoods, steeped in bigotry and anti-radicalism of the 1950s, awakened by the stirrings of the civil rights movement and other global events. I got an appreciation from Patrick for how different the early 60s were from the late 60s, and the dramatically different pace political life can take according to the inertia of a moment of period of radicalization. He vividly described his encounters with the torch-bearing red diaper babies he met in the Ban the Bomb and civil rights movements, and how they all wore beards and used the motherfucker word, and had apartments in that characteristic international style of the bohemian left, with Picasso and Ben Shahn posters tacked to the walls and candlesticks jammed into old wine bottles. And I, really felt like you were there. In that conversation, Patrick also assured me that the nature of the period is bad. It's the fucking worst it's ever been in the whole history of our movement. But that the mechanics of capitalism were bound to produce new radicalizations, like the ones he'd experienced in the 1960s. And rather than the slow accumulation of ones and twos, suddenly socialist meetings had lines out the door. Joanna had a talent for grasping and distilling the general dynamics of these sorts of political developments. She had a unique perspective of major shifts on the horizon, always looking at the big picture, keenly connecting the dialectical relationship between objective and subjective factors, and an ongoing preoccupation with the question of an appropriate political instrument for the time. However, this political analysis is always deeply rooted in a kind of gritty, blue-collar humanism and a visceral disgust at the material and psychological indignities of poverty and racism. She, like Patrick, never forgot where she came from. She always grounded her broad and bird's-eye view of the world with the felt impact on the lives of working people, including tensions and chauvinism within the class itself. I associate this vantage point as well with the virtues that she emphasized, which are often in short supply in the left: humility and self-critique, an ecumenical appreciation of other viewpoints, and openness to new ideas and being wrong. As someone who is ultimately dedicated to the interests of humanity and the international workers' movement above all, she welcomed unexpected developments that proved her predictions wrong. I know that the growth of DSA, for example, was something that filled her with excitement in recent years, encompassing in a different form than expected the long-awaited rebirth of socialism in this country. I'm going to end with another excerpt from that same talk from 1991. A new socialist movement must begin by ensuring an atmosphere of solidarity, commonality, and cooperation among us, even when it comes to determining where we strongly disagree. Naturally, combining our efforts would enhance our effectiveness. But more than that, the collective and humanistic values of socialism are absolutely incongruous with the conduct exhibited in our past. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Kay Mann, and I'm very glad to be here with all of you. I'm very glad to be here with all of you because we're celebrating the lives of three of our friends and comrades, and in some cases, family members. But I also have to say it's a very sad moment for me. These are great losses for me, I know, and for you as well. And to lose all three of them in 1 year is particularly painful. So I had thought about preparing something carefully prepared so I would get everything. And then I thought the best way I could honor them would be to speak just spontaneously from memory and from my heart. I'll start with Abra. Abra, I knew the least because we often weren't in the same place. Actually, we were often in the same place, but not at the same time. That could be Paris or Chicago. And sometimes we would cross, our paths would cross, and it was always a real treat. I know I was very fond of Abra, and I like to think she was very fond of me. We were roughly of the same age. And of course, Abra was her father, Patrick was her father, and Joanna was of the same generation. Abra had a great sense of humor and a really sharp intellect, and when she also had a real understanding of political situation in other countries, particularly in Britain, a situation where she followed quite closely. Okay, I'm sorry. Patrick, I've known Patrick since I joined the socialist movement when I was 19, and he was one of my mentors and then friend and comrade. And I learned a lot from Patrick. I remember sitting on the grass on sunny days in the backyard in Evanston, listening to Patrick share his knowledge with us, to teach us, to talk about other periods. I remember that story about the beards too. They would see this period was so bad they thought if a guy was wearing a beard, he must be some sort of radical, and they could maybe recruit them. And so he had really a great link to that period, and I'll say a little bit more about that too. When Patrick and Mary retired, they spent more time in the Evanston home, and we in Milwaukee got to have them. And so we saw them every week. Every month, we still see Mary every month. And Patrick, to have Patrick in your branch, wow, some of you know that. It was incredible. It was, I had known Patrick at that point for a long time, but then to see him regularly, the political engagements. Yes, Patrick was very gruff, but anyone that knows him it was a front. He was warm and sweet, a diamond in the rough, a big giant heart, and he was so good to me. He was so supportive and so good to me that it's hard not to cry. He was a guide, he was a mentor, and he was very important to many of us. And when him and Mary would go out to see Ruby and Rosie and Rachel and Abra and Tim, their eyes would light up. He loved them so much, and it was so wonderful to hear those stories. And that's how I got to keep up with Abra. And her health, I remember celebrating when she was cancer-free and grieving when it came back. Joanna, I've known a real long time, since really way back, but I didn't know her well until recent years. I got to know Joanna real well when I took over her assignment as Solidarity's representative to the Fourth International. And she was a wonderful guide and mentor. And every time I would go to a meeting, before I would go to a meeting, I'd check in with her. And when I came back, I would check with her. In fact, this summer, when I came back from a meeting of the Bureau, the first thing I did was call Joanna, and I got voicemail. And that evening in the National Committee, we learned via Joel that she had her stroke. And so my talk with her before I left was the last one I had ever had with her. Penny and others have talked about her internationalism. She was very appreciated in the International. Many comrades would want to know about Joanna. The Greek cooking team that came to prepare our meals wanted to know about Joanna. And they all said two things about her: the warmth, the sense of humor, and her political sharpness, very much appreciated. And as some people have mentioned, to have a woman in that position was very, very important as a model for other women. And I would tell, when they would ask, I would say, well, Joanna's not doing too well. Her health isn't very well, but her sense of humor is intact. And it was, and that was it. And her sharpness, I as a college professor, have all rubbed shoulders with colleagues who have had the opportunities to refine their intellects, to refine their speaking abilities and their analytical abilities. And I can tell you that Joanna was as smart a person as I ever met. Really, really whip sharp. And the sense of humor could sometimes be lobbed at people, and you could get a little zinger. I had a few myself, but that was Joanna. That was Joanna. And but she was very, very warm and supportive. I so much appreciated her. And I think it was the last time I talked to her, I told her that I loved her. And it was the funniest reaction. You'll appreciate this, I think. She was kind of thrown off by it. The tough Joanna Misnik was thrown off. And it was kind of, I could tell she was blushing. But and she said, well, I love all my comrades. And I said, well, so do I. You're special. And the like. So one of the great losses with these two comrades is, and it's been mentioned by some of them, they come from this period in the 70s that had so many lessons for today's radicals. And there are other comrades of that generation too, and many of them are right here, but they also have this connection with the international and their knowledge of those debates. And it really is too bad they haven't written more. And so one of the great ways we can honor them is for comrades of that generation to start writing. We should have oral histories. It's too bad we didn't do oral histories with Joanna and Patrick and Abra. So I'm sure when I sit down, I'll think of a few more things to say. But I do want to say how happy I am to celebrate with you and to grieve with you. And these three will always be in my heart, and I know they'll be always in yours as well.
Hey everyone. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Sean. I'm today speaking as co-chair of Chicago DSA, which is an organization that Joanna was a longtime member of, and whose contributions and wisdom that she brought to DSA, I wanted to be here to speak to, because it certainly meant a lot to me, and I know to so many people. One of DSA's major goals, and that we say a lot here in Chicago, is to make more socialist. And not just to make more socialist in times when things are going well, or to make socialists who just think of socialism as Medicare for all or something, but to make lifelong Marxist cadre, lifelong socialist organizers, lifelong socialists. I can't think of anyone who I've been in my life who represents more what it means to be a lifelong socialist than Joanna was. And I feel very grateful and lucky to come into the socialist movement at a time when it was on the upsurge, and to come into the socialist movement in meetings with people like Joanna, who had so much to share, to young people like myself who at the time didn't know what the fuck they were talking about. And Joanna was the first to let us all know that. It feels easier today to say I can commit myself to lifelong socialist struggle when things, despite the troubles, I mean, when a self-described democratic socialist was elected mayor of New York City, not just a few weeks ago, it feels easy. But I imagine it feels a lot harder to commit to lifelong struggle when the left was in some ways in retreat, divided, and constantly reeling from state repression. And I feel so lucky that people like Joanna kept the flame alive for our movement and built a political center that gave us the foundation that we're organizing from today. I was looking through my email trying to find old correspondences from Joanna, and I found an email from, I think, 2018. We had wanted to nominate her for our annual Debs dinner as an honoree, and she declined. And she wrote, I don't think I am what we're looking for in honorees. Mostly we want folks who have shown leadership in the recent period in meaningful struggles on behalf of and alongside of the working class, the warriors of the time. I feel confident speaking for everyone in this room when I say, Joanna, we respectfully disagree. You were a warrior of your time. And I think one of the things that really strikes me going back and reading through old writings of Joanna and interviews and tributes is her remarkable humility. And while I deeply respect humility, it also sometimes makes me sad. And I really do hope that Joanna recognized just how much of an impact she had on so many people, on the socialist movement. I want to build and help build a socialist movement and a generation of socialists who aspire to be people, lifelong socialists like Joanna was. And I want our movement to do more to recognize women as the leaders that they are in our movement, and not always feel like they have to be as humble as they so often are, like Joanna was. I was recently rewatching Joanna's interview with Mike Utrick from Jacobin, and she says a lot of amazing things in that interview, really funny things. I feel like it has to be remarked on just how funny Joanna was. But the thing that really struck me rewatching that interview was just how much optimism and confidence she had in the working class. And I feel like that's such an important touchstone for us as socialists to remember that the working class can, will, and must govern itself. And through highs and lows, we have to continue to remember that is the center of our politics. So thanks so much, everyone, for organizing this, and thank you, Joanna.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's really good to see everybody here. And I want to really encourage anybody who wants to get up after these, prepared remarks to please, please speak up, because we really want to hear from you. So I'm just going to say a couple of things about Patrick and Abra, and then a few things about Joanna. My name is Noreen, and I'm here in Chicago. And Patrick, little known fact, Patrick was the best man when Rob Bartlett and I got married. And Patrick was a very good friend and political comrade for years. And I think back on Patrick, and of course I see him with his pipe, and I see him talking about the political context and the importance of understanding the political context in order to be able to move forward. And recently we were able to go up to Lake Geneva and spend some time with them, and to see how Patrick had completely thrown himself into the life of Lake Geneva, and meeting up with old friends, making new friends, basically exploring the history and the political history and the working class history of Lake Geneva. That was really actually sort of a revelation, and he did a ton of writing when he was up there. So and I hope to be able to read some of his writings, which maybe the family will publish. Abra, I remember because she was so quick-witted. She was so funny, and she was somebody who was actually very fast to laughter. And I haven't seen Abra. Well, I saw Abra at Patrick's memorial, and it was so good to see her. She was just, her same self, but many years intervened, and so I just don't feel like I know I know Abra anymore. But I'm very sorry that she's been taken. So I want to say a couple of things about Joanna. Joanna and I were comrades for, I don't know, maybe 20, here in Chicago, maybe 20-ish years. But we never actually had a real personal relationship until she got sick. So I did learn a couple of things about her. And folks who have a relationship with Joanna, they know that there's bitter, and there's funny, and there's sweet, and there's rancorous, and so that was what it was like. Joanna was fiercely independent, absolutely all the way up to the end, and very militant about it. Joanna loved theater. She loved art. She loved beauty. She loved color, and she just really loved what the world could offer. And even though she also loved politics, and she loved argument, and she loved Marxism, there was also something just worldly about her too. Her family was very important to her. She was one of 4 kids, and her sister died when she was about 9 years old of cancer. Her brother died at about 21 years old of an accident. And then her remaining sister was basically, she died very suddenly at the turn of the century. And this was really, very impactful on Joanna. And she has, many memories that she kept with her and carried around with her. She was absolutely devoted to her niece in Cleveland, Lenore. And she maintained a very good relationship with her. And Lenore to her. Joanna had a very strong working class identity. And I remember when she would talk about the SEIU 73 workers and how just absolutely, I just see it as sort of like devotion to them. Now, I'm a CTU member, and Joanna would sometimes like really scoff at me like, oh, y'all are the aristocrats of the labor movement. And what about those low wage workers? And so, and then if there was ever any kind of a conflict between SEIU 73 and CTU, well, I heard about it. So, and she would also talk working class politics with absolutely anyone. She was in the nursing home and she was talking to the nurses about, did they have a union? Did they want a union? How much did they make? She had this neighbor who was he was a handy guy, and he helped her around the house, but he was a trumper, and she would engage in politics, in conversation with him. Or she'd be riding the PACE bus to her doctor's appointments, and she'd have conversations with the folks on the bus about politics. So she really absolutely gravitated towards working people. She also really loved her Polish identity. Perhaps little known fact, but Joanna loved her Polish identity so much that when she picked out her doctors, if they had a Polish name, she picked them. Except for the Cuban eye doctor. And then she talked about Cuba. So, everybody has said this already, but Joanna really nurtured the young people and brought them forward, and she saw them as the future and as the hope. And I gotta read this because otherwise I'm not going to say it. She really valued them, but they really respected her, and you've heard a lot of that today. Joanna was she had her 2 feet planted on the ground. She was always living in this moment, analyzing how to move forward. And she didn't actually spend that much time looking backwards. And many people in our tradition do that. They're sort of rooted in arguments from the past, but not Joanna. She was always looking forward. She believed in the centrality of the working class and the centrality of the labor movement, that rank and file workers should control their unions. She also believed that socialist organization was necessary, and she was really encouraged by the growth of the DSA. And she saw it, I love this phrase of hers, she saw it as the vehicle for the working class to rebuild a class for itself. I think she would have been very encouraged by the DSA's around victory in New York. And Joanna had a visceral hatred for capitalism, for war, for avarice. And just the last thing I'll say is, the other evening, Rob Bartlett and we went to a picket line for the Teamster workers, the Mauser workers, in like Brighton Park, sort of. And we were talking to a few of the workers, but there's like 8 or 9 young DSA folks, all under 30 years old. And all I could think of was, I'm going to channel my inner Joanna, and I'm going to go get in there, and I'm just going to have a conversation with every single one of those young people, because that really is our future. We're in a moment where I think Joanna would see that we have to seize on every little thing, a kernel of hope that we have, and move forward as a class.
Well, it was nice to hear my name mentioned a couple of times. And one thing I wanted to start, though, with was that the political context that many of us came out of, which was a real rise in revolution. And the things that I think really affected both Patrick and Joanna were the civil rights movement and, of course, the Vietnam War. And then at a certain point, basically things turned south. And we had to then live through a very long period of a downturn. And so, but nonetheless, these were people who were committed for the long haul. And they were also committed to build things. Like I'm going to talk briefly about both Joanna and that. But I think that this was the thing that was hardest for all of us who became radicalized in the late 60s or early 70s, or even later, when all our hopes and dreams, basically, they sort of frittered away. The organizations we built grew smaller. They fractured. They did so on. I know that in our particular case, we had been, all Joanna, Patrick, and myself had been in the SWP, and we engaged in incredible factionalism. And at the end of that time, basically, we were expelled. The little group that got expelled split again. And then we were basically forced to look back at our tradition and talk about, well, the political disputes. What was important? Well, should we really have these fights that go to the bitter end with somebody either leaving the group or so on? And then, of course, we were so small that I think both by political conviction or change of ideas in terms of being able to realize that we don't build small groups. We want to build big groups, groups that are broad and diverse. And that was a lesson that I think was very hard for many of us to learn. And it took it took amount of time for different people. That was what led to our attempt to try with a couple of other groups who I think found themselves in a situation of necessity, too small to really exist on their own and to have a realistic prospect of growing. And so we formed solidarity with the idea of regroupment. Now, I have to say that in retrospect, I think our idea of regroupment was really way too narrow. We looked for people who were really pretty close and similar to us. We tried to expand that out to be able to bring in other groups who were from different traditions. It didn't work. And that was a shame, but maybe it was for the best, because then we have their explosive growth of the DSA, which really was the regroupment that we probably should have been wanting all along. Something that was a broad tent that had many diverse opinions, an ability to be able to shape things. Now, a few things about Patrick and Joanna. I know Abra, but I think other people have said more important things there. Patrick I met in '72 in Madison, and we were both this is where I became recruited to organize politics after being sort of a cynical radical. When we were part of a rank and file caucus within an ASME local that we both belonged to. I think Patrick had some really wonderful qualities, and I know that I learned a tremendous amount from him. He always argued, he recruited people, but the thing that was most important was that he was the glue, both in a couple of places, Madison, in the keeping that group together of the YSA or the SWP, and being part of the political give and take. Same thing here in Chicago when Solidarity formed. I think that he was our glue in our branch as well. And so I think that's one of the things that's most important about him. Now, I think it was Isaac who mentioned my first impression of Joanna, which I have to repeat. And that was being at an SWP conference. And there was, maybe 1,000, 1,500 people there. And it was in the middle of the factional fight that was going on between groups across the world who were parts of the Fourth International. And so there was a French comrade who came to give a speech. And I remember his name, but I'm not going to repeat it. And she gave the translation, and it was the best political translation I've ever heard. It wasn't that she was precise in what she said, but she embodied the politics that was being expressed because she was a part of that. And I was just awed. And so I remember then later sitting around the lawn with a circle of people getting the wisdom from Joanna. And so I thought it was, really quite an amazing. And I'd say that I think that maybe Alan Wald once said in one of the things that he wrote that when he went to Paris and met her, that he felt that she was head and shoulders above everyone politically. And I think that's true. I feel really privileged to have been, be able to talk to her, not probably be as mentored as, the younger people, but to be able to have that experience of working with somebody who was so dedicated. Now, the other thing I'd say is both Patrick and Joanna, I think family was really important for both of them. Patrick, his personal family and his political family. He always kept ties with people that he had been in movements with in the past. I think if you will go back through Against the Current, you will find numerous articles that he writes about somebody when they died, tributes. And I always thought that he should be the person up here speaking about himself, because, and he should have written that obituary. Because frankly, he would have done a better job of it than the rest of us. Joanna, I think, had some of the other characteristics that are really difficult to describe. Nobody could deny her political smarts. I think she felt at times a little bit, well, certainly slighted, that really not recognized in the way that she should have been. And although she had tremendous confidence in herself, it was something that I think our movement never really fully encapsulated. And this is something that's our struggle to go forward. So I know that both of them were considered incredible optimists, because who couldn't be an optimist to fight in these times and over basically 50 years of downturn. So just in closing, I'd say that's what we all want all of us to be. I hope that we can continue this struggle until we get to our dying moments as well. And hopefully we'll have a party for us as well. Thank you.
Okay, I wasn't going to do this because these are three people mean a lot to me. I remember showing up at Detroit in the spur of spring, actually, of '95. Didn't know my ass from my elbow, but I had an interest in socialist politics. And Betsy has just come through and found these new branches. And Syracuse was a branch that was a fairly functional branch, but says something about an internship. And I said, hey, I'm going to do this. Well, apparently Chicago heard that two comrades were coming out to Chicago, and that was supposed to be us, me and a friend, and that wasn't going to happen. But when I realized that wasn't going to happen, I went on to Detroit. I showed up there, and Joanna was my boss. And it was supposed to be for the spring or the summer. Ended up being at least 6 months. Learned a hell of a lot. And, apart from the politics, there's all sorts of funny stories. I mean, people talk about she was beginning to have problems with vision. We had I wouldn't call it a Thelma and Louise experience, but we drove from from Detroit to Chicago for a conference. And I really didn't know how to drive stick at the time, but it got dark and I had to do that. And she was giving me orders as we entered into Chicago. White knuckle experience for me, but we ended up at a conference. I bounced around a bit as an intern, and eventually I ended up living in her place on Hubbard Street. I don't think she ever wanted somebody, especially a young guy, staying at her house. It worked out well. We got along fine. The only regret I have is that, I've been in Europe for 20 plus years, and our communication was sporadic because, the way I communicate with people is through email. It's a visual thing, but I always kept up on things. And I learned a hell of a lot from Joanna, especially in terms of organizational sort of stuff, because I was working at the heart of an organization and never thought of those things. But a year after Detroit, I ended up in Chicago, and boom, Patrick got me a job. And I turned to my right, there's a poster of Bernadette McClaskey, and Patrick convinced Northwestern they had to restore because it had some connection to Northwestern. It was a bullshit. But they restored it, and it's on my door right now. I sent Rachel a message the other day because Ireland just got through on a reprieve, or they haven't qualified for the World Cup, and maybe give a shit about the World Cup. But Ireland might get through. In '94, they did get through, and in '94, Patrick was my boss, and he'd say, going for a pickup. And we went off to some dive bar in Chicago and watched matches. I mean, he humored me on that point, but he also, I remember him holding court and Tommy Nevins, and Mary would be there, and apart from the pints being flowing, then what he imparted on me, I love history, and he was a font of history and the knowledge of the socialist movement, and I love that to this day, and I got it from him. And the only regret I have is, and all the time I've been here, I never saw these people. I was in touch, kind of, but not as much as I'd like to be. I would love to see Patrick Mary over here in Ireland. Abra I was in touch with quite a bit. And I'm a bit shocked because last time I was in touch with her was September. They touched my life, and they will forever. Leave it at that.
Thank you.
I don't have a whole lot of really early memories. I'm a teacher too, and every year one of the journal questions I ask my students is, what do you think your earliest memory is? You're going to write your journal on that. I give you a warning. If there's a photograph of it, it's probably a family story, not your memory. Possibly the first strong memory I have about my dad is when I was 3 or 4. We lived on West Main Street in Madison, Wisconsin, and the first floor flat was tiny, a living room, a kitchen, and 1 bedroom and a bathroom. I slept in an iron-barred crib separated from my parents by a green and white India improvised curtain. I think this may be a memory of something I did several more times than once. I remember that after I learned to climb out of the crib, on nights when friends and fellow activists were over, I would sneak out of my crib and go stand quietly in the entry to the living room, concealed by a different India print curtain. And I would eavesdrop on the grown-ups, and especially on my daddy, and his passionate political positions on the anti-Vietnam War movement, on tactics and ways to build the movement. Eventually I'd be caught, claimed I needed a glass of water, and be returned to my crib. My father frequently said that he was never wrong. I both waged an endless battle to find something he was wrong about, and implicitly believed it. He was never wrong about anything. I built the highest, most polished, most ostentatious pedestal ever, and placed him on it. To the point that even he finally tried to tell me to cool it once I got to college. But I don't think I recognized until my early 30s that no one at all ever should be on a pedestal, and that every single human being has feet of clay. Wow. So I know that he was not always right, but he was still right an awful lot of the time. From his phenomenal memory for facts of all kinds to his instincts for politics, tactics, and strategy. Children often become not what they're told to be, but what they're see modeled for them. Peake never told me I should be a socialist, stand up for unions and ordinary working people, look at how the world could be made fair and equal for all, regardless of difference. But he lived that life, and my sister and I absorbed. I remember that on nights when my mother worked late, my father would make up a bedtime story before tucking me in. In 1970, those stories featured heroes like Che Guevara. Bernadette Devlin McCalliskey was the leader of the national struggle for civil rights in the North of Ireland, and Tony Benn, a radical, maybe revolutionary leader in the British Labour Party. I was very surprised once I was in Britain in my 20s to find out that Tony Benn was not a long-haired radical youth, but a white-haired British Labour Party. I was very sorry. He even went to the trouble of researching Russian revolutionary history to try to find or invent a Russian princess who sided with the Bolsheviks. I have no idea if this person was real or not. Possibly he was thinking of a real woman from the Russian upper class who was a revolutionary in the teens, Inessa Armand. He named our black cat Inessa anyway. My dad loved cats, as you saw in the slides, and he always gave them interesting names. Inessa for the revolutionary woman who had an affair with Lenin, Cleo for the Muse of History, Philo for Philo Judson, one of the founders of Evanston, Judson, also for Philo Judson, 3 Burmese cats, one he named Exley after one of his favorite authors, Frederick Exley, one Frida after Frida Kahlo, and one Malcolm after Malcolm X. His last little female Siamese was actually named by Mary, Jerusha, the wife of Philip Maxwell. But PQ had a very strong sense of aesthetics, and he enthusiastically endorsed that name. I also remember less political moments, like Sunday mornings in Madison when I was 5 or 6 years old, and my dad would put me up on the back of his old black bicycle, and it's no child seat. I would stick my feet out to the sides and hold on to his belt, and cycle off to look for a Sunday paper, and occasionally go out with me for Sunday breakfast. Then he'd cycle back to Dickinson Street, a Sunday ritual observed. I remember one time he bought a coconut and brought it home. He got Rachel and me to inspect it, feel it, smell it, thump it, shake it, hear the sloshing. Then he used a machete to whack it open on the kitchen floor. Gave us pieces of the coconut and finished his performance by telling us to look at his bicep and squeeze it, noting that it was the same size as the coconut. Not long after that, he got laid off and blacklisted from the State Historical Society of Wisconsin, and while he was applying all over the place for jobs, he also got day work at the labor hall as a construction worker. He'd been trained by his uncle and used as forced labor as a kid, but if he was lucky enough to be chosen to work that day, he'd be doing the unskilled heavy labor. Every night when he came home, I would unlace his work boots, tug them off and put them away, hang up his yellow hard hat, and then get him a beer and popcorn while he sat exhausted in his black vinyl armchair watching the evening news. I remember him talking about how much he wanted to follow where the Rand McNally maps showed the highways going when he was a little kid in Lake Geneva, but how he never traveled further away than Chicago and Milwaukee for baseball games until he was in high school. He was determined, like Rachel said, that my sister and I would learn about the United States and about other places in the world through travel, as much as he could afford. We went on long car vacations every August from when I was a toddler until my parents split. By 1978, we had traveled to 38 states and most of the Canadian provinces and one of the 2 remaining French territories in Canadian waters, Saint-Pierre. Otherwise, he introduced us to the idea of other cultures by having us go out to eat almost every Friday night to storefront restaurants in Chicago that were different ethnic cuisines. Yes, Chinese and Italian and Mexican and Greek, but also German and Polish, El Salvadoran and Puerto Rican, Korean and Vietnamese, Japanese and Thai, Cambodian and Irish, Portuguese and Persian, Lebanese and Pakistani and Indian. My dad had a mania for getting us to memorize facts, like the 50 states and their capitals, quizzing us relentlessly. He would ask both of us random fact questions all the time, making us into excellent takers and passers of standardized tests. And almost every Christmas gift he ever gave me was educational. A globe, an enormous illustrated dictionary, a 1-volume children's encyclopedia, which I was still using sometime in middle school. He crowned this when I was a sophomore in college, leaving for England for my junior year abroad. I went 2 months early, and he gave me a Euro pass. And I visited a lot of places in Europe by myself. I traveled on the train to Paris, Amsterdam, Stockholm, Gdansk, Poland, Paris again, Parma and Venice, Paris again, Oviedo, Lisboa in Portugal, and finally back to England. My dad thought his daughters were the most brilliant, the most beautiful, the most political, the most everything. He was overwhelmingly proud of us. And later of his granddaughters, also the most brilliant, the most beautiful, the most political, the most everything. One of my dad's friends in Mexico, Peter Gellert, quoted the playwright and poet Bertolt Brecht to describe Hugh's life, in praise of the fighters. There are men who struggle for a day and they are good. There are men who struggle for a year and they are better. There are men who struggle many years and they are better still. But there are those who struggle all their lives. These are the indispensable. I would add one more Brecht poem, illustrating the attitude to history which PQ passed on to his daughters and granddaughters. Who built Thebes of the Seven Gates? In the books you will find the names of kings. Did the kings fall of the lumps of rock? And Babylon many times demolished? Who raised it up so many times? In what houses of gold glittering lima did the builders live? Where, the evening that the wall of China was finished, did the masons go? Great Rome is full of triumphal arches. Who erected them? Over whom did the Caesars triumph? Had Byzantium, much praised in song, only palaces for its inhabitants? Even in fabled Atlantis, the night the ocean engulfed it, the drowning still bawled for their slave. When Patrick Quinn said that he believed the wave of genealogy sparked by Alan Haley's roots offered the bricks and mortar of a new social history, he was also echoing his belief in the strength, worth, and future of working people. Nothing's too good. Nothing's too good for the working class.
Hi, everyone. So much has been said already about the political acumen, the humor, the smarts, brilliance of our three comrades that we have lost. And I want to just share a few vivid memories. I'll share just a few vivid memories about each of them. First of all, Patrick. Patrick was a tremendous teacher, and he could be bombastic, bossy, know-it-all, but I just have wonderful memories of sitting around my dining room table with Patrick, I think Rob, others who are various times on the exec board of our branch. And anything that I would say, Patrick had, several authors that he thought I should read before I said anything more. And I am reminded of this because right on the wall, right by Joel, there's a quote by Mike Davis, and Patrick was the one who introduced me to Mike Davis. In fact, I might have said, well, who's Mike Davis? And he couldn't believe I didn't know Mike Davis. I have a memory that I want to share about Abra, and I specifically want to share this with Rachel and with all of you. Like everyone, remember Abra is just a really smart, thoughtful, deep-thinking person. And I remember one time being in their dining room. Marty was there and Abra, and it must have been sometime in the 80s. And I don't remember what the topic was, but it was some political policy, some kind of regressive policy that was being discussed or promoted by the federal government, or maybe it was going on in Evanston. I can't imagine that. In any case. And I think it had to do with women's health or sexuality or something. And Abra said, I really worry about the effect this is going to have on my sister Rachel. And I don't know, for some reason that's always stuck with me. And I think when I read the beautiful words that Rachel wrote about Abra after Abra died, and the care and attention that she took for her students, both in the curriculum that she developed and the classroom library, I thought about that and how, in addition to whatever she thought ought to be done pedagogically and politically, she really had empathy for others. And I think what I read about her teaching reflected that. And finally, Joanna. I also really only got to know Joanna on a more personal level as she was getting sicker, and after I retired, I entered the rotation of people who were available to help her. One thing that I'll relate is I actually am the person who found her on her couch, completely lucid, but unable to move, and she had been there for about 48 hours. None of us had heard from her, and so I took my, key and went over, and and found her there. And she, he had to call 911, and the fire department came and the EMTs, and they were packaging her up to take her to the emergency room because she couldn't walk. And one of the firefighters asked her, well, I explained that she had been stuck on this couch for 2 days and unable to move. And the firefighter said, well, how are you planning to get off this couch? And she said, well, I've been contemplating that question for the for the last 48 hours. And finally, I think we all kind of got to know another side of Joanna, and her material side is, as Noreen mentioned, she loved color. She had, as we were moving her from one setting to another, and then eventually having to clean out her apartment after she passed away, we became intimately familiar with all the stuff she had. And not only was she a historical materialist, she was a material girl. She loved stuff and had dozens of beautiful scarves and really delicate pins, and it kind of showed a different side of her. But one of my favorite things that we found, or that was in Joanna's apartment, and it was a quote that she had typed up and put behind her on her the wall behind her computer, and it gets to her class allegiances. It was a quote from one of the members of one of the SEIU members, and it says, "I take out your trash, but I'm not your trash." And I think that just totally sums up the human dignity that we're all, fighting for in what we do. So yes, their memories will carry on with us.
Hi, so for those of you who don't know me, I'm Emily. I'm Debbie and John's daughter, and so I'm going to talk about Joanna as somebody who I knew first from the personal, and unlike many of you, I only got to know her in the political sense in later years. But, I was, as my mom alluded to, one of the two people lucky enough to get to call her my Auntie Jo or my Auntie Jojo, or when we really wanted to needle her, my Auntie Yo-Yo. And she was such an ever-present figure in my life. There's never a time I don't remember her being there. The only thing that changed was the exact hue of red and the exact cut of her hair, but she was always there. I remember going up and playing with her cats in her house in Detroit when I was very little, and then having her here all of the time once she moved to Chicago. I remember her showing up every Thanksgiving with bottles and bottles of red wine and shrimp cocktail and baked brie, and, showing her cosmopolitan love of food. I remember her showing up to Christmas with bags and bags of random hilarious presents. I remember going every time there was a release of a new Victorian period piece to the movies with her, or talking with her about the early seasons of Top Chef, which she loved, especially the season where the very proud Polish-American contestant made it almost to the end. So she was somebody who was always there in my life. And I think for many of us, when we think about Joanna, the first thing that comes to mind probably isn't kid person. But she was that for us, and she was somebody who, when she loved you, when you were part of her life, she made you, feel like you were the center of her attention. She would, humor watching our, ridiculous puppet shows. She remembered and asked about all of my friends in elementary school. She was the person for several years when I was kind of old enough to not want my parents to go, but too young to go with friends who took me trick-or-treating around the neighborhood. And she just, was somebody who was just there for me in a way that was really remarkable. And I don't think I should have known, because I was a child who was brought up in every solidarity, childcare setting that there ever was. But I don't think I really kind of recognized her as a political being until much later. And I have a couple of memories in high school when it began to dawn on me kind of what a force she was politically. One of them was I was coming out of some classroom in high school in the gym building, and I saw her there, and it turned out she was there for some sort of SEIU meeting with workers in the building. And I remember a particularly gruff security guard being like, wait, you know Joanna? You know Joanna Misnik? And me being like, well, of course I know Joanna Misnik. She's my aunt. And he was like, oh, she is the best lady. She's crazy, but she has your back. She is the best. And I remember just being like, oh, she exists outside of my house, outside of my little world, and she makes a difference to a lot of people. I remember when I did, one of my first early kind of political activities independent of my parents and was part of a, walkout against the war in 2003 and went downtown to the main demonstrations. And of course, the first person I ran into there that I recognized was Joanna, holding court with a group of young people, who she was marching with. And so over the years, it really came to be something that I got to know her in that capacity too. And I've only lived in Chicago for a few of the last 15 or 20 years. But when I was here, I got to know her in some other ways. I got to work alongside her at the Illinois Labor History Society. I got to, be involved with meetings around independent electoral politics in Chicago. I got to help out with her at CTU strike headquarters during the 2012 strike. There were a lot of different ways that I got to see her and admire her and be the beneficiary of all of those acerbic but brilliant asides that she had at every function I ever saw her at. And, I think one of the things that I take away from her in that sense is, I think I remember being kind of confused. She was critical of everyone and everything that we ever experienced together politically, but she didn't leave, right? She stayed and she used those critiques because she believed that there was a purpose in it, that there was something to stay and fight for. And, I think even before I knew of her as kind of somebody who was part of my political consciousness, she's somebody who shaped me in a really deep way politically, because as somebody who that isn't really my personal tendency, having a woman in my life like that, an ever-present woman who was so completely unapologetic, so completely opinionated, before people really were saying that, she, had run out of fucks to give, and she let you know it at all times. And I needed that, I think growing up seeing that in somebody is huge. And, so she is somebody who I'm so, glad that in her later years as she was declining physically, even though I wasn't around regularly, she still made a huge effort. When I was pregnant with my first, at the tail end of the pandemic, she made an effort to get to my baby shower, to have people order her a gift, even though she couldn't really see to shop. And so I think of her every time I see that stuffy, that my older son plays with. And I also think of her all the time in my work. And when I chose to go the academic route, Joanna was not afraid of sharing with me her scorn for leftist academics who cease to be able to talk to the people they study. And she is somebody who I think of all of the time in so many ways in terms of how I approach my life, how I approach my work, how I approach thinking of family, found and otherwise. And so I'll miss her terribly. And thank you.
So this seems like a thematically appropriate time to read a little message that was sent to me by David Roediger, but then I also have on the list John, Alan, and then Alex over Zoom. Is there anybody else who would like to be added to the list to make reflections? Okay. So David wrote, "Hi from San Juan. I just talked with my older son, Brendan, who's now a movement lawyer in St. Louis, about Abra's childcare work with him about 40 years back. He recalled her great engagement and patience, remembering, as I did not, the two of them laminating an entire deck of playing cards together when he was perhaps 6. That was in Columbia, Missouri. It made me think about what a terrific school teacher she must have been. My memory of their being together is that she had him watching his first World Cup match with rapt attention in Evanston when he was 4. My own memories of Abra include being an equally patient and effective activist, one who was clearly in it for the long haul. She was also a wonderful graduate student historian, producing a brilliant MA study of race and labor radicalism in the Louisiana timber industry while working with me at the University of Missouri. At that time, Purdue had a splashy conference at which the keynote speaker was invited to bring 2 of their graduate students to also speak, along with Purdue students and area faculty. Her work was the clear highlight of the event. You want to speak next, or John?
And people here that know me know it's very difficult for me to speak before any amount of people. So that in itself is a tribute to Joanna that I feel like I can share things and that people will understand, because everybody has a different slice of life experience to share here. Some of them intersect, some of them are parallel, some of them are very diverse from each other. When I first met Joanna, she was very warm because of the Polish connection and the working class connection. We had similar families. She had an abusive father, and so did I. That's part of the reason that I'm timid about speaking publicly, because I was afraid to speak as a kid. She got over it. She got over it in spades. I was reminded of France in '68 when it was mentioned before. That reminded me about how similar and how different our lives diverged or converged. I was a young, semi-political person who thought I was a radical, but I was a left hippie basically at that time. Joanna was working for the 4th International. She was an amazing person, and I learned this later, and it was confirmed at a 50-year anniversary of '68. I'm just stringing together random things. When I first met Joanna, I felt like I was at times the butt of her jokes, because she would refer to me as Johnny, and she could tell immediately that it got my goat. But after a while, I realized that it was in a loving kind of put down, not just attacking me. And she would listen to me. She would talk to me, even though I was in awe of her expertise. She would converse with me, and I think that's what we all share.
My name's Alan. And first of all, thanks to everyone who's gotten up and shared here. It's really something I'm very glad to have the opportunity to learn more about 3 people who I've literally seen across the room in political meetings since the early 1980s, and yet have never gotten to know them the way I should have. It's something that I reflect on in terms of my experience on the left. As much as I felt like the work we did was indispensable. I think like the narrowness of the traditions and the narrowness of organizational boundaries, I think, is something I regret. I got to know Joanna in particular, though, over the last 5-6 years, when after the dissolution of my former organization, the International Socialist Organization, I started coming around DSA, and it was indispensable to have someone in DSA who I thought most of the same things with, but also someone who had lived through the history that I had, or at least a lot more of it than I had, but to understand how to understand this new formation that had such a different thing. It was really important. I mean, one of the things that someone said before about that Joanna, I think, was dedicated to non-sectarianism, but that didn't mean that she wouldn't argue with you. I think it's something that I think is really important for people. I wish that could become an ethic. It's something that people who are newer to politics might not understand, because Joanna is ready to tell you exactly what she thinks. But in my experience, like, if you argued back and you convinced her, she'd change her mind. And that doesn't happen enough, I think, on the left. She was always ready to come back for more. So I think that was really important to me. I'll just say one last thing. I've been telling people that I first got to talk to Joanna one-on-one in 2019 when I came around DSA. I realize now, after listening to the discussion, that I first really had a long discussion with her in 2017 at the DSA National Convention, which I attended as a reporter, as an observer. And one of the highlights of that was a panel they put together where there were generations of people from DSA talking about their experience of what made them a socialist and what kept them a socialist. They only spoke for 2 or 3 minutes at a time, but it was brilliant to see people who were 6 months, a year into being a socialist up there, and Joanna stole the show. Joanna was able to connect that experience of those newest people with the experience that she had that was so deep and so vast. It's what I think Isaac said at the beginning, the importance of revolutionary continuity to Joanna. And like that, to me, feels like something that I'll take for myself about trying to further that continuity between older generations of the left and the new left that's arising today.
I'm Lillian. I met Joanna in 2016 or 2017 at a Jacobin reading group. She came up to me at the end of the group and she said, you know, I make a point of introducing myself to any other women that are in the room. And at that moment, I hadn't really thought about the fact that the whole room was men and that Joanna, you know, was making a point. So I was thinking, who is this old woman with these glasses on who's, you know, coming up to me? And I didn't get to know Joanna on a super close personal level, but I can remember like every time that I interacted with her, because every single time is a story, like where she was just the most outrageous person I've ever met, truly. Like, and it gave me so much confidence to just like be myself and be like a weird lady, basically. One story that it was at the 2019 socialism conference, and she and I went into a talk. I won't say who was giving the talk, but it was someone who she was going because she didn't like them. And I follow her into the room. It's kind of starting early. There's some other like young socialists there, and they're like, "Oh, Joanna, great to see you. What are you doing here?" Whatever. And she said, "Oh, I'm the speaker's mother. And these young people who didn't know Joanna, I guess, very well were like, no way, I didn't know that. And she proceeded to sit at the very front of the room, right in front of the speaker, and heckle him the whole time. It was one of the most astounding things I've ever seen. And at that moment, I was like, oh, this woman is a legend, you know? But at the same time, like, she was a heckler. And, like, I'm kind of a heckler, too. Let's just, admit it. If you're a heckler, like, she would sit at the front of DSA meetings. She couldn't see at that point even very well at all. And she was still up in the front and center, commenting on things and making her presence known. And I just feel like that is something that, like, especially as women, we don't often get to see someone who does that. And also, I mean, as other people said, she was so brilliant, and she had this way, I think, that is, like, really unique. There are so many people who are smart and can measure politics, whatever, but Joanna could read a room, and she knew how to intervene in a really plain way of just saying what's happening and not being afraid to name it, which, as a Midwesterner, it's refreshing to see somebody actually just speak up and say what's happening. And, for example, Robin mentioned her involvement in the Bernie 2020 coalition. And I remember we had this meeting, and it was very exciting. There were so many different, like, organizations, especially of young people, but some socialist groups, other smaller ones wanted to be there. And so they came, and afterward, Joanna went up to one of the activists from who she saw as behaving in some sectarian behavior at the meeting, and she confronted him and was like, I don't like what you're doing with this front group or whatever. And I just was, like, in such awe of her ability to just say it, and that she could just get to the point. And I guess the last thing I want to say is, thank you to the people who took care of her. That is how I would want to be treated, and is a really beautiful thing that you guys did. Making it possible for her to stay politically active. I think it sets a tone of, like, we all have a huge responsibility. And I think being here with all of you, that, like, what we have right now is really precious. And that we have a huge responsibility to Joanna and to one another to keep building it and keep trying to, carry the torch from one generation to the next. So thank you.
Uncharacteristically short. With full solidarity for all three comrades and special human beings whose lives we're celebrating today, I just want to say a couple of quick things about Joanna, who I knew for many decades, but sadly was not as close to as a number of the people in the room who have been in organizations with her most recently and have already so eloquently spoken about. In her last place of residence that Anne referenced, and in that part of her life that Rob also spoke to, about wanting to do all she can in whatever way she could, even with so many limitations, we had a conversation about what she would do with other residents in the building where she lived, which included going out to the corner and banging pots and pans against genocide and the suppression of rights, which of course were happening in the last part of her life and have only grown more intense. And it makes me think of several years ago in one of the demonstrations during Occupy Chicago, there was a protest in a plaza downtown where there were a number of political organizations who each has their literature tables, as they do. and a number of them were staffed by people younger than her, younger than me. And she went around to each of the tables and she said, "Can you please hurry up?" She said, "I, only have so much time left and I would like to see, fundamental change. Can't we bring around the revolution faster?" And I think that in light of all the discussion here, that's kind of a characteristic thing of hers, being aware of the critical time we were living in, and I'm certain that she thought that about the times we were entering in the last part of her life and are living through now. Without being unrealistic about that, she still retained the hope and the promise of what young people would do, and that we could be related to, but which the next generation, was getting the baton and had to run with it. And I think she would be incredibly encouraged by the nature of resistance and solidarity happening in Chicago today and elsewhere around the country. So I just wanted to say that.
Hey everyone, it's good to see, I'm Alex from Knoxville, Tennessee. It's good to see, hear from comrades that I haven't spoken to in a number of years, and feels really appropriate to, that it's in Joanna's honor that I'm seeing some of you for the first time in a while. I wasn't planning to say anything, but listening to, Isaac and everyone talk about their very strong first impressions of Joanna, made me think of when I first met her and how that sort of, like with almost everyone who's spoken, sort of that first impression sort of defined my relationship and memory of her. It was like 2008, 2009. I was 20 years old and had just joined Solidarity and didn't know anything. I was going to Chicago for the socialism conference, and I'd never met or spoken to Joanna, but I just knew I was supposed to stay with her on her couch. And we ran into traffic or something like that, and so we were running late, and it was like after midnight when I got there, and I'm like, I am staying with this older person I've never met. I'm probably keeping her up. So I get there at like midnight or 1, and she's got a bottle of bourbon on the table, and for the next several hours, I proceed to have my mind blown, in the way that I think all of us are when we first met Joanna. And I mean, I think I was adopted on day one, I guess, and over the next decade or so that I was close to Joanna on Solidarity's leadership and at Fourth International leadership meetings and so on. We repeated that all night drinking experience many times, and I think Joanna was not just my sort of introduction to revolutionary politics outside of what I had read or students I knew or whatever, but has been really like the voice in my head at all times, and still is, when I try to think about what it means to be a revolutionary or a political leader, in a way, in terms of grasping the situation we're in as a world, as an organization, in the room, as people have said, and just seeing how to intervene in that and what it means to think strategically about that, and not just slogan-y or whatever. I'm one of my biggest regrets is that over the last however many number of years since I left Solidarity, I haven't really been in touch with Joanna. I've seen her maybe once or twice, but even when I was in Chicago, I never managed to stop by and see her, and I really regret that. But I'm really glad to hear that she did have a lot of comrades around over the last few years.
Thank you, everyone. I didn't miss anybody who. Last call. You don't have to go, or wait, no. No, please.
It's all right.
Okay, well, we won't. So yeah, that pretty much concludes the program, such as it is. Oh wait, no. What the hell am I talking about? Yeah, we have to sing the Internationality. And so this version is in your program books. You will find the Internationality, which is for whatever reason, you know, when I looked this up to copy and paste it, I found that in my mind was kind of a combination of the U.S. Charles H. Kerr IWW version, but then with the British or South African refrain. So I modified it to be what my memory was, because I think that that's what I recall having sung. And this picture of Abra at the top is actually a picture of her singing the Internationale at the closing of a conference, Revolutionary Work at Our Times, in New Jersey in 2008. But before we do that, I also want to mention that there, Promise Lee wrote a reflection on Joanna's life that is printed in Against the Current, which there are copies in the back, and then it's also online. And after we sing, people are welcome to stick around and solidarize. And there's a backyard here as well with this uncharacteristically warm weather. And, you know, we can continue to informally connect and share stories. So, no. What's that? You do whatever you want. I'm not gonna, you know, you're gonna jump and sing. In fact, Diane, you're gonna lead us. Okay. All right. All right. Does somebody want to? Is there a more most confident?
Arise, ye prisons of arise, ye wretched of the earth. For justice thunders condemnation, a better world's in birth. No more traditions change shall bind us. Arise, ye slaves, no more enthralled. The earth shall rise on new foundations. We have been not, we shall be all. 'Tis a final conflict. Let each stand in their place. The international working class shall free the human race. Face the final conflict. Let each stand in their place. The international working class shall free the human race.